Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Robert. Happy Friday, and if you're here in the United States, happy Memorial Day weekend. I hope you have Monday off. I had to say here in the United States because I was looking at the wonderful YouTube analytics the other day, and I was surprised to find that just over half of the views of my channel come from outside the United States, which I found fascinating and kind of cool. 3% of my views come from Norway. So whoever you are, identify yourself. I think that's awesome. Anyway, so I'm here for Friday Reads. I'm going to talk briefly about the read-alongs, the status of the read-alongs, and then I'll talk about what I've been reading this week. It's been a pretty good reading week for me. So the read-alongs. This is the third week of the read-alongs, and we're in the middle of the first of our selections from the 20th Century Backlist. We're reading, this week we're reading Amy Bloom's debut work of fiction. It's a collection of a dozen short stories called Come to Me. And my reaction video to that collection will be coming Sunday. So I still have a few more of those to read, but I'm almost done with that collection. And then looking ahead to next week, it'll be our first selection of nonfiction, and it'll be Matthew Desmond's recent work, Evicted, which is examining poverty in American cities. And if you're looking even further ahead, we'll start the second cycle, the June cycle. We'll go back to the list of 100 essential novels, and the first of them is Anthony Powell's work, A Dance to the Music of Time. Now this is actually a 12 novel sequence, and we're only doing the first one, and the first one is called A Question of Upbringing. So if you'd like to join with us on that one, we're just going to be reading the first novel, not all 12, don't panic. My edition actually has the first 3 novels bound together. It's the University of Chicago edition has put them out in 4 volumes. Each one's called Movement 1, Movement 2, so on. And so I just went ahead and got that in case I enjoyed enough. I want to keep reading some more. And so that will take us through the first week of June. So we're wrapping up the ones for May, and we'll be starting again with the Anthony Powell in June. But for me, it's been a good reading week. Last week, I told you I was in the middle of reading Benjamin Meyer's The Gallows Poll, which is one of the finalists for the Walter Scott Prize for historical fiction. And I finished that. I enjoyed it. I was impressed by it, but there were some things that annoyed me too. One of the things that he does that I think detracted from the novel and made it about 75 to 100 pages longer than it needed to be is he loves lists. He loves catalogs. For instance, early in the book, when the main character, King David, he calls himself, is bringing together all the people that are going to start on their mission to forge coins, Myers gives you a brief name and background of every single one of these characters, most of whom don't even appear again in the book in any significant way, and it's just overkill. I think in the striving for authenticity, since it is actually a true story, he's gone overboard in with the details that are not necessary for his narrative. He's similarly inclined to go on and on and on when he's describing the moors in England, the natural description of the region. They're beautiful descriptions, but 2 paragraphs would suffice, where he will go on for 5 pages. That just got, towards the end, it got a little tedious for me. I don't think I noticed it as much in the beginning because it hadn't happened so often then, but the longer it happened in the book, the more it started to bother me. But that's really a relatively minor qualm with the book. I don't know if it is the Walter Scott Prize winner potential. Of the 4 that I've read, it's certainly in the running because I wasn't wowed by any of the other 3 either. I still have 2 more to read, and I have until the middle of June to get to those last 2. I'd like to actually have read all 6 before they announce the prize to see if I agree or not. I never am in a position to do that. Very rarely have I read the entire short list for anything when they announce a prize. So I'm anxious to actually be in that position this time. But it's an interesting book. If you're interested in historical fiction, it tells a really interesting story about 18th century Yorkshire and about these it's kind of a Robin Hood style story where they're fighting against the encroaching industrialization of the area, and they want to fight back against the crown, so they start what they call clipping coins, where you literally clip parts of coins off and then make additional coins, thereby devaluing the currency and making yourself rich illegally. And it was a crime that was punishable by death, and so it carried a very severe sentence. It's an interesting book. I enjoyed it, but like I said, it wasn't perfect. I'm not sure if it deserves to be the winner, but it's certainly in the running of the 4 that I have read. The second book I read, I actually went to my public library, which I very rarely do. I love the existence of libraries, but I'm usually too impatient to get on a long waiting list for a book that I want to read, so I don't often go to the library. But I just thought I'd try it out, and I checked out 2 books from the library recently, and one of them was Samanta Schweblin's Fever Dream, which has had a lot of press over the last year. She's an Argentinian writer. It's translated from the Spanish. It's a very brief novel. It's a one-day read. I spread it out over 2 days just because I started late in the evening. But it's a one-day read. It's hard to describe because even after finishing that novel, I still don't know what really happened. And maybe that's part of the point. I don't know. Maybe it is just all a fever dream. But there is a woman named Amanda who is obviously sick or disabled, or something has happened. She's in a medical clinic of some kind. They're in some kind of a resort town outside of Buenos Aires, there for vacation. And she's there with her daughter Nina. And the neighbor to them, her name is Carla, has had a young son named David. And at the beginning of this book, David is sitting on the end of Amanda's bed, and they apparently are having some kind of conversation. And for a long time, I still wasn't sure whether they were having an actual conversation or whether this is in Amanda's head and she's imagining it. But there's a lot of really weird stuff going on in this book. David apparently 6 years ago, Carla tells Amanda the story that David got really sick from some kind of poisoning. And they don't really have great medical care, so she took him to a psychic, essentially. And the psychic said the only way to save him is to split his soul into 2 and cast part of it into somebody else's body, and she wouldn't know whose that body was, as a way of weakening the poison. And it apparently works because he doesn't die. Now, whether that's just all bullshit or whether it really is, magic realism, who knows? In this story, it's impossible to know what's actually happening. But David is different afterwards. He's weird. And so he is having this conversation with Amanda. And basically, Amanda seems to have been in the same position where she's been poisoned somehow, and David's trying to talk to her about something before she dies. And it just goes on like that. It's just this weird tension-building conversation that keeps going, but you don't know where it's going. Even at the end, it doesn't really get anywhere. You don't have any resolution to what's been going on in this story. I did not go and read a bunch of reviews on this one. I probably should. Maybe somebody's figured out what the book is actually about. It wasn't me. I was compelled by the writing style, but I have to admit, at some point, my logical brain wants to know what really happened. And this book just refuses to do that. And so, write it all off as a dream of Amanda's? I don't know. That's an easy out, but it doesn't really resolve anything for me. So it was interesting. I think I ended up rating it 3 stars. I liked the writing style, but I was annoyed by the lack of a definitive resolution. And so it was okay. I'm glad I read it. It's funny because I've read 2 books in translation recently, both very brief novels, The Vegetarian by Hong Kong and now Fever Dream by Samanta Schweblin, and I was completely baffled about both of them. So maybe books in translation aren't going to be my thing. I don't know. I'm glad I read them both, but they both really threw me for a loop. And then I've started 2 more books. So this is a 4-book week for me. The third one is, of course, the Amy Bloom collection of short stories I mentioned. That is for the read-along. And I'm not going to talk about that today because I'll do a full video on that Sunday for the read-along. But the other one is the other book I got from the library, which I mentioned in my last set of independent bookseller recommendations. It's a nonfiction work called The Feather Thief by Kirk Wallace Johnson. The story is fascinating, and I wouldn't think it'd be fascinating to me because it's about topics that I generally don't care about. But apparently in 2009, a young American musician, he's a flautist, was playing a concert somewhere in London, and after the concert, he went to this outpost of the British Natural History Museum in Tring and broke in and stole an entire suitcase full of rare bird skins and feathers and specimens from this museum, and got away with it, disappeared. 2 years later, the author is fly fishing. I believe he was in New Mexico. I may be wrong about that. And his fly fishing guide starts telling him the story about this heist, and he's just fascinated. And so it's the story of him pursuing this story. And I've read about half of it so far, and I'm loving it. It's marketed as another orchid thief. If you remember Susan Orlean's book from many years ago called The Orchid Thief, it's similar to that because it's a tale of obsession. It's a tale of natural destruction for something that's, beautiful in nature. But the whole thing is really about a bizarre culture in the world, the culture of fly fishing, tying of the flies. Apparently, and he gives the whole history. First of all, what made it so interesting is he gives the history of the man who collected these specimens and risked everything for them. He was a naturalist who was a contemporary of Darwin's and possibly came to the idea of natural selection at either the same time or maybe even slightly before Darwin. But all of his samples, after a decade of collecting, were destroyed when the boat he was on, the ship he was on coming home, went up in flames. Every single specimen was gone, so he couldn't prove anything. But he gradually made a name for himself by giving talks about what he did discover, and then he went out and gathered more specimens, and that's what was stolen in this heist. But the reason that they were stolen is this culture of using feathers in salmon flies. He talks a lot about the Victorian period where these birds started being collected and exterminated, basically. Some of them became extinct because of it, because ladies wanted to use these feathers in their hats, and these fishermen wanted to use them for their fly fishing. And he even throws some shade at Sir Isaac Walton, the author of The Complete Angler, because Walton was such an incredible snob that if you weren't using the most exotic feathers, you weren't a real fly fisherman, you were just an amateur. And so there's this culture of wanting to have these flashy, exotic birds, both for the hats and for the men, for the flies. And what's really interesting is apparently the guy who stole all of these from the museum in Tring wasn't even a fisherman. He just enjoyed tying the flies. There's a whole culture apparently of people who don't even fish. They just make these lures. And then he talks a little bit about fly fishing, not that much, which is good because I don't care anything about fishing. But he said there's a difference between trout fly fishing and salmon fly fishing. When you're fly fishing for trout, the fly has to mimic a certain stage of an insect's life cycle, depending on what time of the year it is, the river you're in, and things like that. And so they're very easy and cheap to make because you're using very bland, natural things that are easy to find. Salmon aren't feeding on these insects when you're fly fishing for salmon. You're fly fishing for salmon when they're spawning, and what they're doing is they're laying their eggs and then protecting those eggs until they die. And so you want something that really stands out as a fly for salmon. You want it to be bright and unnatural so they think it's a predator and they will attack it. And of course that's how you get them on the line. And so it's for the salmon fishing that these exotic, colorful feathers are so attractive, because you can use almost anything that looks unnatural to them and they'll bite at it. So the story is fascinating. The detective work is just starting at the point where I am in the book now, so I don't have much to say about that yet. I'll wrap it up again in my next Friday Reads. But I'm really loving it. I'm actually doing this one as a joint text and audio version. Sean the Book Maniac and Kendra Winchester have both convinced me to give Scribd a try for audiobooks. I'd tried a couple other services, and Audible is just too expensive. I mean, it's $15 for one book, and that's all you get a month. Scribd is, I think, $9 a month, and then you can listen to anything in their library as much as you want. And so I'm using it occasionally. I used it with Fever Dream, which I don't think was the greatest, but I'm using it for The Feather Thief, and I think it's wonderful. The guy who reads it, and I don't even know who it is, the guy who reads it is doing a great job, and so I'm really enjoying that. So it's been a good week for me. I finished 2 books. I've nearly finished the third, the short story collection. I think I have 3 stories left. And then I'm about halfway through The Feather Thief, which I will finish sometime this weekend because I have to take it back to the library. So it's been a good week for me. I hope it has for you. If you do have the long holiday weekend, I hope you have wonderful plans. My Memorial Day weekend plans are pretty much like my plans every other day, and that is not much. I read. I'm trying to do a little bit of writing, hanging out. You can kind of tell looking at the background that the weather isn't the greatest here in South Florida. It's the beginning of hurricane season, and there's some talk that a tropical storm might dump some rain on us pretty heavily this weekend, and everything out here right now is pretty wet. In fact, every time the wind blows, this tree above me drops water on my head. So I'm getting this in before the rain starts. But it's been a good week. I hope it is for you. Have a great weekend. I'll be back on Sunday with my read-along wrap-up for Come to Me. And then we'll get started on the 4th read-along next week with Evicted. Talk to you later. Have a good weekend. Bye.